My husband likes to say, if your mind was blown by muscles, just wait until we get to neurons. So we're here at neurons. So let's look at the functions of nervous tissue. The nervous system is going to help the body by collecting information. So there are specialized nervous structures called receptors that are out in the body that are sensitive to different types of changes in the internal or external environment. So we'll say receptors detect changes in the internal and external environment. And those changes are called stimuli. So we're going to have different receptors that are sensitive to different types of stimuli, and we'll look at those as we move through the specifics of the system. So the first function is going to be to collect information, and it's receptors that are doing this. They're detecting changes in the internal or external environment. Those changes are stimuli. The next function is going to be to process and evaluate all of that information. So add it all up, everything coming in, and decide what to do about it, if anything. So you're taking the information and determine what, if anything, to do. And then if you have to do anything, the third function of the nervous system is going to be to initiate a response to that information by sending out motor commands to effectors. So you can initiate response by stimulating effectors to bring about change. And as with all anatomy and physiology, we can break it down based on the anatomy or the structures or the physiology, the function. So the first way that we divide the nervous system is into the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. And then the other structures we call the peripheral nervous system, everything out there in your periphery. So those are going to be nerves that are exiting your brain or your spinal cord. These things called ganglia are groups of cell bodies. We'll see those in a minute. And one thing that's missing from the peripheral nervous system here is our receptors. So add that. So our central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. That's going to be really our control center that's intaking all of this information from the peripheral nervous system. And then it will be execute motor commands that go back out to the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is made of nerves. We have ganglia that are groups of cell bodies, and receptors that are bringing the information in. Then if we break it down and organize it based on function, we'll see that we also have two branches. The sensory nervous system that's detecting all of those changes in the environment and transmitting the information to the central nervous system. And then the motor nervous system, which is executing the commands that are going to go out to the effectors from the central nervous system. So our sensory nervous system has two branches. The part that you're aware of, or your somatic sensory system, so this is what you're aware of. So it could be things like changes in temperature, pain, when you taste something on your tongue, when sound waves hit your ear. All of that is coming through the somatic sensory system. So that sensory input is going to be consciously perceived. We also have a branch of the sensory nervous system called the visceral sensory system. Viscera is always referring to organs. So there are things going on in your organs all the time that you're not aware of, but your central nervous system is. So the visceral sensory branch is taking input from receptors that you're not consciously aware of. So things like stretch of your blood vessels. I mean, if your heart really starts beating, you've got a really increased heart rate or something, you might be aware of the increased rate like at some of your bigger vessels, but that'd be because they're hitting tactile receptors that you would be aware of. I mean, you're not going to actually feel your blood vessels stretching. So all of that information is coming in through your visceral sensory system. So this is everything that you're not consciously aware of. So let's say not conscious. And it's referring to what's going on with your organs. So that your central nervous system is always monitoring what's going on everywhere. You just may not be aware of it. The other branch then of the nervous system is the motor branch, which is going to initiate and transmit the information from your central nervous system to the effectors. So it's going to take all of this sensory input and decide what to do, if anything. And if we're going to execute a command, it's going to come out through motor neurons. And we've got, again, two branches. The somatic motor nervous system, which is what you voluntarily control. So the only effectors in the somatic motor system are skeletal muscles. Those are the only things you have voluntary control over. Everything else is going to come down through your autonomic motor system, what we're going to call the autonomic nervous system. This is really, really important for your understanding of 202. All of the other organ systems are being controlled by your autonomic nervous system. So this is the motor output that you're not consciously or voluntarily in control of. And so the effectors are things like your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, and your glands. So autonomic, you should just think automatic. You've got no input, it just happens. All right, so tissue is made of two or more cells working together to provide some function in the body. So the cells that we have in nervous tissue are neurons. These are your signaling cells. They're excitable and conductive. And then we've got a bunch of glial cells that are supportive. So these are supporting cells. And we'll talk about the specific types of glial cells in just a little bit. So our glial cells are going to support our neurons. Neurons are the cells that are doing the business of the nervous system, which is sending all of these signals around. So we can look at the characteristics of neurons. And the first, like muscle cells, they're excitable, which means they can respond to a stimulus. The next characteristic of neurons, like muscle cells, is they are conductive, so they can conduct an electric current. The third characteristic of neurons is that they produce and release a secretion. So, and in this case, it's going to be a chemical neurotransmitter. So neurons are also secretory. They secrete, which means they produce and release a chemical. In this case, it's a neurotransmitter. Another characteristic of neurons is they have what is known as extreme longevity. That means that neurons you're born with, you die with. So you're actually born with more neurons than you could ever possibly use. And as you go throughout life, you go through what are called neuronal clippings, where you kill off the neurons you're not using and you solidify the connections you are using. The characteristic of neurons that they do have in common with muscle cells is that their neurons are amitotic, meaning that they do not undergo mitosis. And they don't have to, because you're born with more than you need and more than you can use. So in the case of the nervous system, it's really true. If you don't use it, you lose it. So what happens is at prescribed points, and they're generally pretty recognizable points in your life, you go through these neuronal clippings, cut out all the things you're not using, and strengthen and solidify connections you are. So you see your first at 3 years old. You see the next at 5 years old. You see them at all of these different developmental stages in children that you can see these really big changes in levels of understanding. And why you're gaining so much more understanding is because you're really solidifying the connections you use. So the best advice I can give you as aging adults is to always try and pick up new things, even if it's just picking up like Sudoku and trying Sudoku for 6 months, and then pick up a crossword puzzle book and do crosswords for 6 months. Pick up an instrument. Even if you don't want to play any songs or whatever, just start strumming on a guitar. So that way you're using more brain area, and every time you come to one of these clippings then, you'll have more connections that will be maintained. It will really stave off dementia and Alzheimer's. Alright, so let's look at a neuron and what are the parts of a neuron that we need to worry about. So the structure of a neuron is that they are these big long cells. They have these big cell bodies. So the cell body is also called the soma. This is where the nucleus is. So that's like the brain of the neuron is up here in the soma. And then coming off of the soma, we have different types of extensions. All of these little extensions at the top here are called dendrites. And dendrites are the receiving parts of the soma. So all of the information that's coming in is going to come in through the dendrites. Sometimes you'll have neuron synapse right onto the cell body. So this whole part will be the receptive segment. But our dendrites are are receiving branches, basically. So they're receiving information. Then if we look, there will be a big long extension that comes off of the soma, and this is called an axon. And this will be conducting the information away from the cell body. And then way down at the end of the axon, we have these axon terminals, also called telodendria, which are like the branching regions. So the branches of the axon. And the telodendria are going to terminate in our synaptic knobs that we met last chapter. So this is the synaptic knob. And it's going to transmit the information from the sending neuron to the next receiving neuron. So it's turning this electrical message into a chemical message. So the synaptic knob is going to transmit information. So those are all of the parts of a neuron. We have different types of neurons in the body, and again, we can classify them based on structure or based on function. So we'll start by looking at their structural classification. So the most numerous types of neurons that we have in the body are multipolar neurons. They're multipolar because they have many branches coming off of the cell body. So if you look at the cell body, it's this enlarged region with the nucleus, and then we can see that there are lots of dendrites here that are branching, coming into the cell body. And then we've got one axon that's extending away. And the axon does branch, but it's just got one axon. So those are the most common type, and they're multipolar because they've got many things sticking off the poles. If these are different poles of the cell, then this receiving segment has many, many dendrites, and the conducting segment has one axon that's going away and branching. The next type of neuron that we have by structural classification is a bipolar neuron. And it's bipolar because it's got two extensions. It's got one dendrite and one axon. Both are branching, but if you look at the cell body, it's only got two things coming off of it. One dendrite and one axon. As we move throughout the system, we'll see different locations where we find these guys. Third type of neuron that we have by structural classification is a unipolar neuron. So if we look at the cell body, it's just got one short extension, and from that, a big long axon is going to branch, and at one end it does have little dendrites. So this is how our sensory neurons that are bringing sensory information in, this is the arrangement. These little dendrites are associated with some specialized sensory receptor out here in the periphery. And then really quickly though, they're generating these impulses that are going to send this action potential along the axon. This peripheral process is the part that's out there in the nerve. The central process is entering the spinal cord to bring that information into the spinal cord. Or the brain, depending on what kind of nerve you are. So the unipolar neurons are they've got one extension coming off the cell body. And then the last type of neuron that we have by structural classification is anaxonic, N being without, and axonic being without an axon. So these only have dendrites, and so they are only going to be receiving information and creating what are called graded potentials, not action potentials. Alright, so that's how we classify neurons based on structure. We can also classify them based on function. So if the function is to bring in sensory information from some peripheral receptor, then you're a sensory neuron. And sensory neurons are also called afferent neurons. And anytime you see afferent, it's always bringing something to whatever it is we're talking about. So we'll see this next semester as well with other organs. Afferent is bringing information to, in this case, the central nervous system. So it might help to think of afferent as approaching. They both have an A, so it's approaching. They're bringing in information into the central nervous system. So these are our sensory nerves, and as we can see, these are those unipolar neurons. They've got these big long axons that are stretching out, and they've got these little dendrites that are in contact with like skin receptors. So that you can, we've got lots of different types of receptors in the skin that we'll talk about when we get to spinal conduction pathways. They're going to be able to stimulate these dendrites and then send that information along this long axon back to the central nervous system. What we can see here is one of these ganglia that we saw in that first picture. A ganglia is a group of cell bodies. And so when you're looking at the spinal cord, you can always tell anterior from posterior because the posterior have these posterior root ganglions. And so that's where all of these cell bodies of our sensory neurons are located. And then they've got this central extension that's going to branch and come into the spinal cord and bring information to the next type of neuron by functional classification, the inner neuron. So inner neurons are the link between sensory and motor neurons, and they are totally contained in the central nervous system. So you can see this is a multipolar inner neuron. It's bringing in information from this sensory neuron, coming in these dendrites, and then we'll be able to transmit that information through an axon to the next type of neuron by functional class, the motor neuron. Yes?
Back to the ganglion, is there usually like more than one?
Oh yeah.
So it's like a groupage.
Absolutely. This is just trying to show us one. But yes, there are tons of cell bodies in here.
Okay.
That's what makes it so thick. Any other questions? Okay, so our inner neurons are the second type of neuron by functional class, and they're linking our sensory neurons to the next type of neuron, the motor neuron. The motor neuron is also efferent. It's bringing information out of the central nervous system to the effectors. You can think of efferent as exiting. There's an E in exiting.